Reporting, Chuck Soule, Northern Pacific Railway Historical Association, January 3rd, 2024. Take it away. It's all yours.
Okay, well, we'll jump right into the PowerPoint screen here. Um, this presentation got put together for the Northern Pacific Historical Association convention in Tacoma on about a week's notice when one of the presenters had to cancel out. And so I got together with Jim Hannum, and he provided me with the basic outline, and I fleshed it out with both um, pictures and maps from his article and that he sent me otherwise, also help from Brian Ferris. And so what we have here is how the Northern Pacific Railroad came to Thurston County, Washington. The initial surveys and authorization, not just to Olympia, but to get the heck out to this coast. 1853, Isaac Stevens was appointed governor of Washington by President Franklin Pierce, who had been West Point classmates. And en route, he led the 1853 survey party for the northern route for potential Pacific Railroad. The survey party also included Major George B. McClellan, who later became commander of the Union Army at the Potomac during
Chuck,
the Civil War.
Chuck, you're not
Yes,
sharing your screen.
I'm not.
No, let's try again.
Now
Go
you
ahead.
are.
Now I
Okay.
am? Okay,
Yes, now
sorry,
you
folks.
are. Okay, thanks everybody.
Okay.
Back to live action.
Okay, so here we are with Isaac Stevens, who was appointed territorial governor and did his survey. As a result of the survey, Stevens recommended a final route over the Cascades, while McClellan preferred a route that went down the Columbia River and then north to Puget Sound. And I find that kind of interesting because one of the things I remember from when I was in Boy Scouts was climbing this point called McClellan Butte, which is one of the higher points along the west side of Snoqualmie Pass on the south side, kind of above the Milwaukee railbed. But anyhow, so those guys went through the area and argued with each other over what was the best route. The Stevens survey became the principal guide to construction of the Northern Pacific. And he was killed in September 1862 at the Battle of Chantilly, Virginia. So here we have coming into Olympia, 1853, we've got the Stevens Survey. 1864, the NP was chartered. 69, Jay Cook, that insufferable financier, began selling bonds for the Northern Pacific. 1870, they started building at Carlton, Minnesota, and the western terminus had not yet been selected. 1871, Kalama was selected for the starting point to build to Puget Sound, and the formal western terminus on Puget Sound still hadn't been selected, but they started building north and reached the Toutle River. Why Kalama? It had deep water on the Washington side of the Columbia, so it didn't require ocean-going ships to go all the way to Portland, and because they could get in close to the bank, it was easier to unload rails and locomotives. It was also ice-free in the winter. 1872, the rails reached Tenino, but the Puget Sound terminus still had not been selected. The principal contenders were Olympia, Steilacoom, Tacoma, Seattle, Mukilteo, and Port Townsend. So what were the factors? Well, we may call them nefarious when we look at things through our various eyeglasses, but there was a lot of real estate manipulation going on, and it wasn't just the big shots at the NP, it was the other people who were trying to get the big shots to come to their place so they could make the money. And they also had to sell bonds to finance it. And there were other practical factors like easy grades, maximizing their federal land grant, and property that was topographically suitable for railroad and port facilities. So, calling all land speculators. In 1873, Tacoma was selected. Olympia was rejected primarily because the harbor had way too much tidal mudflats. Steilacoom was rejected because it wasn't a protected harbor. Seattle was rejected because the railroad management felt the most desirable land was already owned and it would be too expensive for the NP to obtain enough property. In other words, Yesler and Denny would make a lot of money, but not the principal NP investors. Also, the railroad was running out of time and money, and probably wouldn't have reached Seattle by its December 16th, 1873 deadline, which was set by Congress to get their land grants. Mukilteo was rejected because it was even farther than Seattle. Port Townsend was rejected because it was even farther than Seattle, and the construction on Hood Canal would have been difficult. On the plus side, though, Port Townsend would have been a good seaport location, but it was just too far away. Tacoma was selected allegedly because it had a decently sheltered harbor. In reality, it also had a lot more land available for the NP's owners, speculators, to obtain. In addition, it could be reached more quickly than Seattle. So the heritage we have in Tacoma today of these speculators, well, the principal director of the Northern Pacific who was promoting Tacoma was Charles B. Wright. And we still have Wright Park, Charles Wright Academy, and Annie Wright School. We also have Sprague Avenue, Oak Street, Ainsworth Avenue. And considering the history of the man in relation to Tacoma, it's rather surprising we have a Villard Street. But Villard Street, admittedly, is pretty far out on the west end of town, not down in the heart of it. So construction of the NP in the 1870s and 80s. The first line was built from Kalama up to Tacoma, completed in 1874. The Villard's crew, the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company, built from Portland up to the Snake River, Columbia Junction. They finished the track as standard gauge in 1882, did at least with the NP in 1883. The NP started building east towards Minnesota from out of the Tri-Cities, and that was all was completed in 1883. They also built from Portland up to Goble on the Oregon side of the river in 1883, and then they built the line from Tri-Cities over Stampede Pass to Tacoma, was completed later in 1887. So, like I was just talking about, Kalama to Tacoma, 1873, ORNN in 1883, Duluth to Spokane to Columbia, Snake Rivers, completed in 1883. The last spike was driven at Gold Creek, Montana, just a little ways west of Butte, on September 8th of 1883. Portland to Goble, completed 1883, and the ferry service from Goble to Kalama was started at this time. So you could get, by 1883, you could take a train from Portland to Goble and then ferry over and continue the train up to Tacoma. Columbia Snake Rivers, as I said, Stampede Pass was finished in 1887. So Olympia and the selection of the terminus. General Sprague was the general manager and the NP's Western Division during its construction. He lived in Tacoma after it was established as the terminus. But in 1870, an NP survey crew drove a stake in Olympia to start a survey to the south. And this was widely misinterpreted as meaning Olympia would be the terminus. In reality, it was just where they started their survey. In 1872, General Sprague responded to an inquiry from Marshal Blinn of Olympia about the terminus, suggesting that one of several parcels in the Olympia area would be selected as the terminus. But then in 1873, when some members of the board of directors toured around Puget Sound, they selected final terminus as Tacoma. So here we have General Sprague, who was the general manager, and Sprague Avenue in Tacoma is named for him. So if we look closer at the NP as it relates to Thurston County, first we have what we call the Prairie Line, which was the original main line, came up from Kalama, up to Tenino, and then wound around through Roy, Lakeview, South Tacoma, and then down into Tacoma. We have the Olympia and Tenino line. The folks in Olympia were very upset that they weren't on the railroad, so they built their own railroad from Olympia down to Tenino. We have the Grays Harbor line that the NP built as a branch from Tacoma, departed at Lakeview Junction, wound across, came through Olympia, and down to go out to Aberdeen Hoquiam. Then okay, I jumped ahead there. Sorry about that. And then we have the Centralia to Gate line, which was a shortcut here. And then we have the surveyed for the showing here for the Future Point Defiance line. This dotted line, since it's from a 1908 map, was the Port Townsend Southern survey line that they were planning to do, and it came just north of Tenino on the PT&S, and then swung around, crossed the Grace Harbor branch just about at the Nisqually River crossing, and then came up along Puget Sound and so forth. First, we have the Prairie Line. In 1871, they built from Kalama to Pumphrey's on the Toutle River, which is also the first bridge across the Cowlitz River. In 1872, they built from Pumphrey's to Tenino, and this is the point where they really had to decide on the final terminus, whether they were going to jump up to Olympia or somewhere else. And then in 1873, they built from Tenino to Tacoma. The first locomotive was the Minnetonka, which has miraculously survived and been restored. This is an 1935 photo when it was restored. It arrived at Kalama in 1870, transported around the Horn on a sailing ship. And this is the first known photograph in Kalama in 1874. Jim Frederickson came across this picture and it was miraculously saved. Not as clear as we might like it, but it's still pretty darn good. The locomotive, interestingly enough, not being the Minnetonka, but a sister of this locomotive still survives today in Winnipeg. It's called the Countess of Dufferin. And when the NP went bankrupt in 1873, they had to liquidate some assets, and one of the locomotives got sold to a contractor, loaded on a barge in Fargo, and floated up the river to Winnipeg, where it became Canadian Pacific's first locomotive in that part of Canada. So they built north from Kalama and they got to crossing the Cowlitz River. This photo isn't quite where the first crossing is. This was the section house, which was built in 1905, so it was a bit later, but at Oliqua, or Oliqua, I'm not sure how that gets pronounced. I've always learned it Oliqua. Unfortunately, this building has since collapsed, but they made it to Tenino. And this photo isn't 1872, it's 1883. All the buildings are decorated for Henry Villard's Golden Spike excursion in September of 1883. But here's the depot, and here's a hotel. Then they made it to Tacoma in 1874. This photo comes from the Prosh collection at University of Washington. We've got the Tacoma Wharf, and Blackwell's Hotel was built out on the edge of the wharf initially, as shown in this photo, but they quickly moved it back to the left against the bank, and the hotel acted as a hotel upstairs and as a ticket office and freight and express and everything downstairs. They built a warehouse for shipping out on the edge of the wharf. I tried to Photoshop this a bit to clean it up. It blurred some things, it cleared up some others, but still we can't do things like identify the locomotive and fun things like that. But we're focusing on Thurston County, so back we go. And here we have the Olympia and Tenino Railroad. In 1872, General Sprague made a statement implying Olympia would be the terminus, but then in 1873, Tacoma was selected. The people of Olympia were very disgruntled, and in 1874, the Olympia Railroad Union was organized, and they tried to get things going, but finally, 1878, it was reorganized as the Olympia and Tenino Railroad actually got completed to Tenino, and the first passenger train did indeed reach Tenino in 1878. 1881, reorganized as the Olympia and Chehalis Valley Railroad. 1887 as the Port Townsend and Southern Railroad. In 1906, I showed that indication earlier. And of course, this line here being Port Townsend Southern surveyed a line from Plum here up to Tacoma running along Puget Sound. Also in 1906, the Port Townsend Southern became controlled by the Northern Pacific and became the Tumwater branch. But in 1914, the NP completed the Point Defiance line along the survey that the PTS had built, pretty substantially. There's some differences. And then in 1916, rail service ended between Tumwater and Tenino, and the tracks were removed except for a few little industrial tracks up in the Tenino area, like to serve the brewery. So, was Olympia going to be the terminus? Here's the locations that were under consideration. This area down around the town of Olympia was just too muddy when the tide was out. But we had Butler's Cove just a little farther over on the west side of Bud Inlet. We had Wiley Claim Area, Gull Harbor, Boston Harbor, and over here, Puget City at Hogan Bay. Puget City was platted in 1870, but vacated in 1873 after it became clear the railroad wouldn't terminate there. It was rather distant from Olympia proper. It was well sheltered from southwesterly winds, but not from the northerly winds. There were no mudflat issues, but grades to get access to the water front probably would have been awkward. Gull Harbor, Wiley Claims, and Boston Harbor over here, all up and down the east side of Bud Inlet. North of the worst mudflat problems, and it appears to be the main area Sprague was considering in his 1872 statement. Several promoters acquired land in the vicinity. Ira Bradley Thomas, a principal speculator, platted the Thomas Addition near Gull Harbor, and that's Gull Harbor is right here. But he died without a will in late 1872, putting the title of the lands into probate limbo. And this might have been one of the significant factors in the Northern Pacific not considering the location any further. Butler's Cove was over here on the west side of Bud Inlet. It's protected from southwesterly winds and fairly well protected from northerly winds. It's not clear why it was rejected for the terminus other than the general Olympia problems of available railroad compatible land compared to Tacoma. The Port Townsend Southern built up here in 1890 as the start of their proposed route up to Port Townsend, but they didn't go any farther. And the original line was abandoned in the late 1890s, but a water level spur was built to a sawmill on the shoreline in section 10, which is right up here. So it did build up here along the water line. And some rails are still in place, but haven't been used in a long while. If you're familiar with Olympia, Tugboat Annie's is a restaurant that's right in here that's at the sawmill location. Significant station locations between Olympia and Tenino. There were a lot of little depots or little locations identified. Tenino, Gilmore, Whitaker, Spurlock, Plum, Sheldon, Beaver/Bush Prairie, Jones Brighton Park, Tumwater. And they had 3 depots through time on the west side of the bottom of the inlet here. The Northern Pacific's depot that we'll see a few pictures of was over on this side of the bay right here. So here's the Tenino Depot. This is a plan that was built in the 1870s on several of the stations between Kalama and Tacoma, and then also one in Puyallup when they built the line up towards Wilkinson and Carbonado in 1878. Here's the other side of the depot. This is the Port Townsend Southern. I initially thought this might have been the first train, but then I saw something describing what the first passenger train looked like, and it wasn't these coaches. So this is some later date. I like this photo partly because it shows the backside of the depot, which is hard to find in other photos when you see this style of depot. The other interesting thing is the color. We think of NP depots either as sand and brown or as Indian red. This is a fairly light shade, but it's not white, as you can tell by looking at the shirts of the folks standing in front of it. Larry Schrenk did some research and thought that there was a light blue color that was used for depots in the 1870s, 1880s. So this might have been that color. We'll never really know. Here's a map of Tenino that Jim Hannum got for me. The depot is this building. There's a hotel right here. It's interesting, I think. You've got the Prairie Line coming through like this, and then you've got the tracks coming from Olympia, which were narrow gauge. And it's really a very simple junction. You come down, got a Y with a single track coming down here, the other leg of the Y, and a single track over here. And then this is the interchange, the Northern Pacific standard gauge track. So this would have been where they transferred loads. So it's always struck me that if you were building a model of this era, this is a great place to fit in either a cameo narrow gauge junction, or if you're modeling narrow gauge, a cameo mainline transition. And you can emphasize either one and just leave the other stuff off into your staging tracks. So we move up to Gilmore, and I don't know what the man's doing here. Is he mad at the conductor, or is he just trying to scare the passengers? But anyhow, we've got a train going by Gilmore, don't have a date on it. Here's where Whitaker was. All we can still see there is the grade. Sheldon. This is an interesting shelter shed. You definitely want your young kids to have a parent to hold their hand getting up onto that platform. Here's Tumwater. This is the only photo I saw of the Tumwater. It was a loading platform. It's undated, but it's possibly 1903 to 1906. I put those dates in there because the NP sold this engine to the Port Townsend Southern in 1903, and it has an NP number on it. And then in 1906, the NP completely took over, and I looked at the roster stuff, and this locomotive wound up at Port Townsend. So I don't know just when, but that's the approximate era. Tumwater, this is interesting because it looks like we've got possibly a beer keg sitting on the platform. Although, if they roll the barrel into the freight car, you hope it settles a while before anyone taps it. Olympia passenger stations. This is the third depot. I didn't come across any pictures of the first and second depots. We jump across the bay, we get to the Northern Pacific Depot. It was used by the Port Townsend Southern after 1906. The photos from 1914. This depot is a plan that was built for several of the large stations. It was designed for, I'm having a mental problem trying to remember the name of the little town on the south side of Grays Harbor out towards the west. Not all the way quite to Westport, but they were going to make that the
Acosta.
terminus. Pardon me?
Acosta.
Acosta, right. Thank you. Acosta. So I've seen a drawing for this depot at Acosta and then had handwritten down below it several of the other places where it was built, including Olympia, Centralia, Chehalis, and there was also one built in Puyallup in the early 1890s. It looks like a standard plan, but it's actually bigger. It's 36 feet wide instead of 24. So now we'll jump over to the Centralia to Gate line, Centralia up to Gate. It was built in 1890. It's interesting junction. And even though this isn't in Thurston County, I like explaining this situation down in Centralia. We've got the Centralia yard here. We've got the Northern Pacific branch leaving up here to go up to Gate. We're looking north is to the right, so that's basically west. We've got a Union Pacific branch that comes up here going out to Grays Harbor. And we've got a Milwaukee line that comes down through here. What's interesting, the railroads all, well, the UP and the NP, they left the Milwaukee out of this, agreed how to shuttle traffic. So all westbound traffic went this way to Blakesley Junction, and all eastbound traffic came in this way. So here is a diagram and a description from the special rules for movement of trains between Centralia and Blakesley Junction. A few quick looks at the line on the NP line, looking east towards the main tracks. We got a bridge going up over the yard here. Turning around, looking the other way, we've got a three-track staging yard. Interestingly, this house is still there all these years later. Then we go up to Blakesley Junction, and this picture is taken from the west looking east down the NP line. So the NP line goes down the middle. The Union Pacific line crosses right here. The Milwaukee line's here, and then this is the junction between the NP and the Union Pacific lines. Here's a view of it from a Google Earth street view camera driving over the freeway bridge. We still got the Northern Pacific line in place in 2013 with what looks like a UP train on it. And we've got the remnants of the Milwaukee line sitting there also. Now, if we jump over and look at the Union Pacific line, looking straight from the by the Northern Pacific tracks, they crossed the Skookumchuck River on an interesting old bridge that is no longer there because this whole line is removed now. And then jumped onto Google Earth and then cut and pasted in a tower to give an approximate sense of where Blakesley Junction Tower was located. We're going west on, is it Reynolds Street? Here's the overpass. The NP line comes up like this, and you can still see the grade crossings there. So obviously the interlocking has been gone for quite a number of years. This is about 1955. This is a train called the Kalama Logger, which was apparently run quite regularly from down around Kalama up to Centralia. And then to get the log train off the main line, they jogged it up the gate on the gate connection and then ran it north into Olympia to the log dumps. So here we have unknown photographer, don't know exactly the date, but they're already building what's now Interstate 5 over the top of the tracks at the junction. And we know that steam was all gone by 1957, in fact, effectively gone by about 56. So there we have Blakesley Junction. One station picture I found along the way at Rochester. Here's the Milwaukee crossed over here. So this was kind of a joint station for the Northern Pacific and the Milwaukee. And then we get up to Gate. And Gate was the home of well, it was basically the Grays Harbor branch and the Chehalis to Gate branch met here. And the main passenger trains would go from Seattle to Grays Harbor, and they'd run a connector from back and forth between Gate and Centralia. And obviously here they're using a doodlebug to do it. So now we have the main Grays Harbor line, built 1890 to 1891. They left the Prairie Line at Lakeview, which is what we think of as Lake Wood today. It's just south of where the freeway freeway junction is now, and to go over to Puyallup. And they crossed the Point Defiance line at Nisqually. There used to be a town called Sherlock, just on the Olympia side of the river, but that was displaced. Here we are at the station of Nisqually. We've got the Point Defiance main line going like this. The freeway, Interstate 5 goes through about here, I believe, these days. And the American Lake line, which was originally the Grays Harbor line, winds down the hill. Notice it makes a sharp curve right here. It used to come straight across and go over before they made the junction with the Point Defiance line. Here's a view up. This is taken from Old Pacific Highway Bridge, looking to the northwest, and here we're looking the other direction. We got the depot and an old store, and this was probably the site of the tracks. In fact, I don't know if we can see tracks right here right now. It's now the highway, or became Pacific Highway after the rerouting was done. And here you can see the bridge and you can see the depot, and we've got the American Lake line, originally Grays Harbor line, coming down. Here's how they crossed the Nisqually River. Brian got me this picture. I really appreciate it because it's such a neat old wooden truss bridge. And we get to Sherlock. Here was the depot before 1912. Here's looking up towards the north, up the original tracks. That's kind of what it looks like today. And then we're looking south. Here's St. Clair, where the original Northern Pacific Grays Harbor branch, actually, when it got rerouted onto the Point Defiance line, they pulled it back off of the Point Defiance line at St. Clair, which was a location that hadn't existed beforehand. The Point Defiance tracks are just off to the left of this picture, and here we have the tracks to Grays Harbor winding around to the right and going up the hill towards Lacey. Here we have the Lacey Depot. It's a Northern Pacific Standard Plan, and just like the one at Leicester and the one at Gate, the crowd there is waiting to see President Taft. And it's still there, only it's not still there. This is a recreation that was done very recently, and they actually used NP standard plans that we made available from PNRA and from the NPRHA Of course, it had to be all routed through modern building codes and everything like that, but they've now got themselves a Northern Pacific Depot in Lacey. Here's the Olympia Depot with Warren McGee posing in front of it in 1941 before the war broke out and he got diverted to other purposes. You can kind of tell from this, it looks like the standard plan depots. It's got the nice fancy curved barge board, but it's really wider. It's at 1/3 wider than the true standard plan depots. So this is one of the ones built for Acosta plan. And it's a passenger station. It's passengers, baggage, and express, but no freight handled here. Looking at the other end, Jim Fredrickson took this picture in '56 with the Grays Harbor local just a few days before the last run. Here's the little station of Belmore, which is going towards Gate. Really just a shelter shed was all that was there. Little Rock, there's a little bit more, obviously. Must have needed a telegrapher for train orders or something, and a little bit more business. Here's Gate again. We've seen that from another direction with the doodlebug sitting at it, like the old locomotive and the train going towards Grays Harbor. So now we'll jump over to the Point Defiance line. It was surveyed by the Port Townsend Southern, but not completed until 1914 by the Northern Pacific as part of the joint agreement with Union Pacific, and runs up from Gilmore. Here's where Sherlock was, and so Nisqually now is right about here, and then got up to Steilacoom and on up around Point Defiance. Jim Hannum just a couple of days ago got me a map from Minnesota Historical Society, and I just tried to splice this in. We've got Olympia down, or I mean, Tenino down here, but it doesn't have very many station names on it. It's really hard to figure out without really digging in, and I didn't have time to Photoshop and improve the graphics on it. But they came on up and curved around, crossed over the lake. This is where St. Clair is, where we've got the original Northern Pacific line coming down and then going off towards Olympia. And we've got the Nisqually River here, so the Nisqually itself was here and Sherlock was right in here. So again, Gilmore, maybe because they were so busy shooting at the train, that's why they departed the Point Defiance line from the vicinity of Gilmore. Plum. Plum was a station on the Port Townsend Southern, but there was just enough business and traffic, I guess, that what they did was they built a connecting line at the new Plum station. So here's the Point Defiance line, and track number 3 is the connection that goes over to the Port Townsend Southern. Chambers Prairie, East Olympia. This was the closest passenger depot on the main line to Olympia. So I think they took their standard 30-foot wide depot to the standard plans of 1906 and added on what may have been just an express office for a little extra business because they had more stuff going down into Olympia from the main line. Cairo was just a little farther up the line towards Tacoma. We have the depot over here, one of those 30-foot wide designs, got the section house and a bunch of section support stuff. St. Clair, here's kind of a more distant view than the one I showed you before. The one I showed you before, he was probably standing right about number 4 when he took the picture. So we have the main line going down towards Tenino, road bridge over the top, and the Grays Harbor branch taking off here and wrapping around the station and going on up. I don't know for sure, but I think what's marked over here as F may have been an original alignment for the Grays Harbor branch. And here I kind of zoomed in a bit on the map Jim gave us. We can see the surveys for the Point Defiance line coming up here, but they show the original Olympia Grays Harbor branch coming down like this and wrapping around. So this is where St. Clair is. This is where Sherlock was, and this is where the Nisqually junction is now. Along the way, which is right up in here, there was a county road went under where they wanted to build the tracks to the Durgan Tunnel. Nice concrete tunnel, but they built, oh, and then here's the Nisqually River Bridge. They had a lot of construction work to do, cuts and fills and so forth. Jim found these photos of the construction that I think are just really, really great. Got the steam shovel, loading them into side dump cars. We've got the construction locomotive and the crew. Here they're doing that Durgan Street Tunnel, Durgan Road Tunnel. They build it out of concrete first, got a big trestle so they can fill over the top. And here they got the trains starting to dump all the fill over the tunnel. Then we get up to the river and they're building the piers for the modern bridge. And you can see because the original tracks diverted over to Sherlock a little farther up the hill at Nisqually proper, they're having to excavate this line through. And that's what it wound up looking like. Construction finished. So, like I said, I did this presentation with a huge amount of assistance from Jim Hannum and from Brian Ferris. And I want to thank them all very much for their help in putting this together. And with that, I'll take questions if someone has them here.
That was really great, Chuck. I think everybody now, I hope everybody was paying attention. Let's all number 1 to 100 on our paper, and we'll start the quiz here in a minute. So that was great. Anybody got any questions for Chuck? George
I
Foster,
do.
go ahead, please.
Well, first of all, I appreciate that the NP would consider naming a branch line after me in Olympia there. If you looked at that one detailed map, it says branch for George Foster. So what can I tell you? I didn't even realize I was alive back then. Anyway, I had some other questions, or not questions, but comments about your views at Blakesley Junction and at Centralia, and then of course, all the way on up the line there to Nisqually. When we would go out on the UP's Grays Harbor branch, like you showed there at Blakesley Junction, so we'd run out instead of the way you showed it earlier. We ran out on the what would have been the inbound NP track to the Y, and then when we got to Blakesley, there it had become an automatic interlocking. So all we had to do was see the semaphore light up, and it was permanently set for, let's see if I have this right. It might have been permanently set up for a left-hand turn at Blakesley for us. And then we just go right out the branch. And then on the way back, I believe the Grays Harbor job would come in on what we thought was the OW track. And that was the one that came straight through Blakesley from our Grays Harbor branch. That way our engine was turned correctly to go back to Tacoma on the Centralia Tacoma turn. So the Centralia Tacoma turn would go on duty at Centralia at 1900 hours. And then they would have an on-duty time for the Centralia to Hoquiam turn as 0100 hours, because by then the local would have gotten back with all the chlorine and caustic soda cars for Cosmopolis and anything that they might have had for Hoquiam. On the rest of the line up there, when you showed the Nisqually part, well, what's on the view right now, construction's finished. That trestle has a speed limit of, at that time, at least when I was up there, 50 miles an hour for freight. And when you're going over that curved trestle at 50 miles an hour and lots of super elevation, it's pretty interesting. It's a little freaky because there's no walkway there on that side, so you're out in space. I did a Form DR train order at St. Clair one time, So we were going south, but we had to use the northward main to run against the current of traffic. So at St. Clair, we had to pull up, line across, back through, and then line back again and run wrongbound all the way to Wabash because there's no other place to, it was simpler to do it that way than to go further down the line before Wabash and then line back over. So that was all interesting. East Olympia, we used that to get down to Olympia for the UP and switch Olympia Brewing and then whatever was in downtown Olympia, Hardell Mutual, Plywood, and Cascade Pole, and those people. I can remember one time we brought 50 carloads of beer on the day job up from Tumwater to East Olympia, and we barely made it. We were just scratching. We had one GP 38-2, and that was it. And then we'd array the cars behind where the depot was on the what would be the parallel leg of the Y with the main line, and then just leave it there for southbound UP trains to pick up. And they would usually hang on to the beer all the way to Portland so that it would go east or wherever it was supposed to go. I think that's all I've got for all that. So I'll take it over to somebody else now.
Thanks, George. That was very helpful. So a couple things that came up. First, you'll notice on your screen, folks, that Gary Tarbox has his hand up and then Ken Iverson does. So if you've got a question for Chuck or comment for the audience today, that's a good way for letting your moderator know. And I also know what order then to call on people. Gary first, Ken second. The other thing is that when we're not talking, if we could just keep our microphone muted for the benefit of other people. So Gary Tarbox, go ahead, please.
Yeah, my question really is, wasn't the Port Townsend Southern owned and surveyed by the Union Pacific initially before the NP took it over?
I don't know that.
Oh, okay.
Jim, if Jim's on the line, Jim Hannum, do you have any comments on that? Or Brian Ferris?
Brian Ferris is here. Brian, go ahead, please.
I don't believe that it was Gary. I think that there was a separate company that surveyed the UP line through Olympia. Port Townsend Southern was actually the southern part of the railroad that was up in Port Townsend. And they had the thought that they were going to connect this line with Port Townsend up through Hood Canal, which never happened.
But what didn't it revert to the NP after the UP went into bankruptcy in whatever it was,
1893?
In 93, yeah, in 93, I guess it was, yeah.
I could answer some of that, I think, if you can hear me.
Go ahead, yeah, take it away.
Yeah, well, the Port Townsend Southern started out as the Olympia and Tenino Railroad that was finished in 1878, and eventually that was bought by the Port Townsend Southern and became their Southern Division, and it never really had anything to do with Union Pacific. Although I've seen, forget who, Robertson's book seemed to indicate that he thought that was the case, but I've never found any indication of that. The Port Townsend Southern wound up being owned, I think, by the Northwest Improvement Company, and then finally went to the Northern Pacific in 1906. And that's what I know about it. It's very complex. I could probably dig out exact dates, but
no, I was always wondering about that. The other question I had was, wasn't the what became the Point Defiance line? Wasn't that originally part of the survey for the Portland and Puget Sound that the UP actually ran through in 1890?
No, that's a totally different right of way.
It's a different one. Okay.
It was a terrible right of way that there's only tiny amounts of that ever got used.
Okay.
later.
I've seen a map of Tacoma in the 1890s that showed the proposed Union Pacific route kind of running west of the South Tacoma shops. And then I think it probably swung over and went down where they started to, where they did the substantial amount of that excavation for the UP's Tacoma Tunnel. It went
Oh, yeah.
underneath Jefferson Center Street.
Well,
Yeah, by the way, Rich Wilkins scanned a substantial amount of that right of way and maps of those that came into the PNRA in some donations. So if people want to see what the UP had in mind for most of the distance from Portland to Seattle, that's available now.
okay, let's go to George quick, and then Ken Iverson's been patiently waiting with his question. Go ahead, George.
So I was going to say that you guys are correct about the UP paralleling through South Tacoma, and when they got to dig the Jefferson Tunnel, they struck so much water that it was impossible to divert it to create the tunnel. So they boarded up the entrance, and the water became part of the Tacoma's source, if I remember correctly. And then sometime in about the 70s, some environmentalists or other groups thought that there was some pollution that might be coming up out of the tunnel because they put all kinds of ties and other paraphernalia in there to seal up the entrance. So they had an environmental survey done and testing and everything, but they found there was no cause for concern with that. So I'll leave it with you now.
Okay, and then Ken Iverson and then Daniel Cozine, I believe. Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try not to make this too long, but
Not all day.
January 1st, 1948, I was the first one born in St. Peter's Hospital in Olympia, and spent my entire youth there until I graduated and went on to college and other things. So I had an awful lot of experience there. And my grandfather owned a transfer company called Henderson Transfer, and he had the contract to handle the baggage from the Union Pacific Passenger Depot downtown Olympia out to East Olympia, and I used to tag along with him all the time. And his little 1948 Ford red pickup truck is what he used. So I had a lot of experience train watching out there at East Olympia. It was interesting to see that picture there that Chuck showed with the train order signal. That was long gone by the time I was involved with it. The restroom facilities were in the back of the depot. I think you can see one of them there. There were two outhouses, gender specific, of course, but that depot was pretty much exactly as I remember it. I think the extension there on the far right there, where the A is, that might have been taken out, but I think that thing was still there when my first wife and I met 450, it would have been 458, I guess. So it probably was torn down shortly after 1969, which is when that happened. Union Pacific line going from East Olympia to Olympia and the brewery connection there. There was quite a hubbub in the 50s when a cut of cars got away from the crew there at the brewery and ended up going all the way down into the downtown Olympia. It cut off the part of the passenger station where the waiting room was, went across 4th Street and ended up in some of the restaurants across the street. And anyway, very interesting. Chuck, that's an amazing presentation. I'm really glad you did that again. Sorry I missed that at the convention. So very much connected with what's going on and with what you just showed. I worked for an appliance company as a high school student during the, gosh, it would have been 64 to 60, well, gosh, I think even beyond that, about 68. And I knew all the routes on deliveries where I could make it close to where the tracks were. So just in case I could spot a train, did a lot of train watching that way. So anyway, I'll give it back to you.
Man after my own heart there, Ken Iverson. Chuck, any thoughts you want to add there before we go to Dan?
Well, not really. That's
Okay, all right. Daniel Cousine, did you have something to offer?
I was just going to say that there is a complete or mostly complete set of the right-of-way map for the Portland Puget Sound at the archives. It's almost a complete set, if not complete, all the way up to Seattle, actually. And the whole thing with the tunnel and the UP involvement, that's all written up very nicely in Jeff Acey's book, UP in the Northwest. So if you want to study it, that's where you look for it.
Yeah, Ken Sullivan, actually Randy got in just ahead of you, Kent. So Randy Hammond, go ahead, please, and then Kent.
Hey, Chuck, on that very first map at the beginning of your presentation, I'm wondering, the NP had not yet completed across the Cascades. And so were they using UP between the Tri-Cities and Portland?
well, it was at that point the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company was not controlled by the UP yet. It was controlled by Henry
Gotcha.
Villard and his steamboat partners, and so that's why Villard was very prominent in wanting the NP to go to Portland, not straight over to Puget Sound, because they wanted all that business to come through all their properties and businesses in the Portland area. Then when the NP went bankrupt shortly, or almost went bankrupt in 1883 when they completed the line, just like in 1873, they had already gone bankrupt by the time they reached Tacoma, and it was just really tight making that last few miles into Tacoma. But they did recover, and then Villard took over I think it's 1881 was when he had his blind pool thing and bought the NP control. And then after they completed the main line, he got really tight financially, and the railroad didn't go bankrupt, but they had to liquidate a number of things. And one of the things, they lost control of the lease to the ORNN, and that's what I understand is shortly after 1883 was when the UP bought it. And then it became the Oregon Washington Railroad and Navigation Company rather than the Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company.
10.
Okay, and now on to Ken Sullivan. Ken's got his hand up. Go ahead,
Hello.
please, Ken.
So I didn't know I was gonna offer this until Randy's question and Chuck's answer. I'm in the middle of reading this book that I just put in the chat. It's been out quite some time, but it's so far been the most readable description of that very confusing series of years with Villard coming and going and the various Oregon something and something companies and the NP and the UP dancing with fire. So anyway, book worth checking out. I'd be incredibly surprised if there's not a copy in the PNRA library. So you could start by looking there to see if it looks appetizing.
There's also a copy available through the company store.
That's true.
NPRJ
the
company store.
right?
A testimonial, dear friends.
Yes.
So my question is actually for Jim. Is he still online with us?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
Hi,
here.
Jim. Hi, Kent Sullivan, researcher. This has to do with a technical aspect of the presentation. That map that Chuck showed that was just recently provided by you, the right-of-way map, that looks astonishingly like a right-of-way map that my research partner Matt and I discovered at MHS about a year ago for the ill-fated first Lake Washington Beltline that was only partially built. And we took some camera photos of it, laying it out on a table, but we're going to be doing a series of presentations on it this year and may want to invest in having MHS do a proper scan. It's many feet long, as those right-of-way maps are. So I'd love to get contact info for you or something and talk about what shenanigans you had to go through with them to get a good scan, because that's what it looks like to me. It's the same kind of map.
Sure, yeah, they have a good service. It's just they're understaffed, so it takes about 6 weeks to get something after you order it.
Right.
They've scanned several for me, and they're $7 per scan, which is not bad in these days.
Right.
They have a big long form you got to fill out, and you got to promise not to do anything nefarious with it, whether you're going to or not. And but it's pretty easy.
Okay. So could I request, because I have Chuck's contact info, could he maybe pass on your contact info to me?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great.
You know, collaborating between researchers is one of the functions of the Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive, and it's always gratifying in these meetings to see people making connections with each other and being able to collaborate on research. Always a good thing, you guys.
Thank you.